Welcome to Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosities, a production of iHeartRadio and Grim and Mild.
Our world is full of the unexplainable. And if history is an open book, all of these amazing tales are right there on display, just waiting for us to explore. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities. Let me paint a picture for you. It was 1944 in German-occupied France. East of Paris, in the country's more mountainous region, a woman furiously pedaled her bicycle up a rocky hill. She'd been traveling for hours to complete a special mission. She was hungry and exhausted, and her legs felt like lead. But then she came upon a Nazi checkpoint. They were scattered throughout France, so she knew this moment was inevitable. Despite the butterflies in her stomach and the knowledge that if she was caught, she would surely be killed, she rolled to a stop beside two German officers. They looked her over. She forced her breathing to steady, then flashed them a friendly smile. In her experience, this was the best way to put German soldiers at ease, to convince them that she was a local villager, a young housewife, a supporter of the Nazi occupation. Of course, this was all a careful ruse. But it worked. The men grinned back. Without even looking at her passport, they waved her through the checkpoint. She thanked them and rode away at a leisurely pace. However, the minute she was out of their sight, she began pedaling harder. She forced her way through the mountains, barely stopping to rest, eat, or even to use the bathroom for 36 hours. By the time she finally reached her destination, she had traveled nearly 125 miles on her bicycle. She made it to the French city of Châteauroux, where she could access a private radio transmission. She sent a message to her contact in London with a set of new codes so that they could reestablish a safe line of communication. This was crucial to an upcoming military operation, one that was called the Invasion of Normandy, better known as D-Day. You see, this woman was a spy for the British government, and unbeknownst to those two German soldiers who had led her through their checkpoint, she was also one of the Nazis' most wanted people. The year before, in 1934, the Gestapo had put a 5 million franc bounty on her head. The problem was no one in the German army actually knew who she was or what she looked like. They just knew that she was impossible to catch, which is why they called her the White Mouse. As for the woman's friends, well, they just called her Nancy. Her full name was Nancy Wake. She was born in New Zealand in 1912 and raised in Australia. She moved to Paris as a young adult, where she met and married a wealthy businessman. The two often traveled throughout Europe, which is how, during the 1930s, Nancy watched the rise of the Nazis firsthand. She promised herself that if she ever got the chance, she would do whatever she could to fight back. When the Nazi army invaded France in 1940, she got that chance. She volunteered as a member of the French resistance. Her wealth and status gave her the ability to cross international borders with ease. So she primarily worked as a transporter, helping vulnerable people get out of Nazi-occupied France. She actually bought an ambulance and used it to help refugees get across the Spanish border. She continued doing this until 1943, when the German army caught wind of what she was up to. The Gestapo put her on their most wanted list and offered a huge reward in exchange for her capture. This put Nancy in a really tough spot. Her husband was a high-profile businessman. He couldn't just up and leave the country without arousing suspicion. That meant that either she had to stay and risk capture or leave her husband and flee to safety. And she chose the second option. Nancy traveled to England, where she was trained by the British Special Operations Executive. In 1944, she parachuted back into France to help Allied forces prepare for the upcoming D-Day invasion. She organized ammunition drops, set up supply lines, and biked hundreds of miles to make sure Allied communications were secure. When France was liberated in late 1944, Nancy went back to Paris in the hopes of finding her husband. But all she found was bad news. He had been captured, interrogated, and killed by the Gestapo over a year earlier. It was heartbreaking. As was the case for most people, the war changed Nancy's life forever. She fought for freedom and lost her marriage and became a new person. Nancy received military honors from France, Great Britain, and the United States. She also eventually remarried and moved back to Australia, where she lived for over 40 years. After her second husband's death in the late 1990s, she returned to England. She died in London in 2011, just 1 month shy of her 99th birthday. According to her wishes, Nancy was not buried in one place. Instead, her ashes were scattered throughout France. To me, it's a poetic ending to a truly incredible story. In death, as she had been in life, Nancy Wake, the white mouse, could never be pinned down. In 1915, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was sitting in his office in the White House, holding his head in his hands. He was in a difficult position, after all. As World War I raged across Europe, he had two contradictory goals: to support the Allied war effort and to simultaneously keep America out of the conflict. This geopolitical dance was exhausting, and it wasn't the only problem on Wilson's mind. Just months earlier, his wife Ellen had passed away from a kidney disorder. The loss was crushing. Ellen was his closest confidant, the mother of his two children, and the First Lady of the United States. Ever since she died, Wilson had been depressed and lonely. He couldn't focus. He couldn't bring himself to care about anything. But that was all about to change. That day, the doors of the White House elevator opened to reveal a tall woman with a mess of dark, curly hair. She was wearing walking clothes and mud-stained boots. Right away, she struck Wilson as a unique kind of woman, one who wasn't afraid to get her shoes dirty. She introduced herself as Edith Bowling, and she certainly was unique. At 42 years old, she was a widow with no children. She'd been born into a prominent Virginia family, so she was wealthy and well-educated. When her husband passed away 7 years earlier, he left her a jewelry store in Washington, D.C., which she ran by herself. The circumstances of her life made her fiercely independent, quick-witted, and adventurous. She was also friends with one of Wilson's cousins, who happened to work as a hostess at the White House, and that's how Edith wound up inside. The president was smitten. He and Edith were married that December, and just like that, the United States had a new First Lady. Edith was known to be smart, fashionable, and gracious, but she tried to stay out of politics. She was afraid of being seen as a, quote-unquote, too authoritative person. It wasn't until 1917, when the U.S. officially entered World War I, that she stepped into a more leadership kind of role. She worked to support the war effort and foster trust with the public. For example, during World War I, the U.S. Food Administration had to ration certain items, like flour and meat. In an attempt to set a positive example for the American people, Edith had the White House follow these same rationing rules. As the conflict went on, though, Edith did much more than choose the presidential menu. She had a gift for puzzles and languages, and she actually helped decode some secret messages during the war. On top of this, in 1918, she accompanied her husband to Europe to visit American troops. This made her the first First Lady to travel to Europe on political business. In June of 1919, she went again to attend the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I. Back in Washington, with a newly international peace established, things were going well for the first couple. But then in October of 1919, Woodrow Wilson's life changed once again. He suffered a major stroke that left him partially paralyzed and completely incapacitated. But here's the thing. Throughout history, U.S. presidents have gone to great lengths to hide their health problems. Wilson was no different. He hid the severity of his stroke from almost everyone, including the American people, the U.S. Congress, and members of his own cabinet. The war had just ended, and Wilson didn't want to introduce any sense of panic or instability back into politics. The only people who knew how sick Wilson was were his doctor and his wife, and suddenly Edith found herself in a very unique position. She was the president's steward. Between October of 1919 and January of 1921, every bit of correspondence with Wilson went through Edith first, and every decision the president made was filtered through and finalized by her. Now, like I said, Edith was always afraid of being seen as too authoritative. She insisted that she never made decisions without her husband's input, but many historians believe that she was far too modest. Edith is considered by some to have been America's first unofficial female president, a decision-maker who worked behind the scenes when the real president no longer could. After his term ended, Woodrow and Edith Wilson retired to a townhouse in Washington, D.C. Wilson died 3 years later, but Edith lived on for another 4 decades. These days, the Wilson House is a National Historic Landmark and is open to the public for tours. Inside, you'll find multiple portraits of Edith Wilson looking fashionable, gracious, and authoritative, which, despite her own reservations, is certainly not a bad thing. I hope you've enjoyed today's guided tour of the Cabinet of Curiosities. Subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts or learn more about the show by visiting curiositiespodcast.com. This show was created by me, Aaron Mahnke, in partnership with How Stuff Works. I make another award-winning show called Lore, which is a podcast, book series, and television show, and you can learn all about it over at theworldoflore.com. And until next time, stay curious.